vote on the Safety of Rwanda bill is literally at 7 p.m. as this event finishes. So if you are checking your phones, I understand. That is okay. Your attention might be elsewhere. But I would plea that actually it is even more important on a day like today, when there are challenges on particular policy issues, on particular bills, that we do take a step back, that we consider, as we look both back on the last 13 years to an election, but also to the next 5 or 10 years, what are the ideas, what are the principles and the values that should be animating the Conservative Party and the broader Conservative family? And that's what we want to talk about this evening. And that's because we've launched this initiative at Onward, the Future of Conservatism project, chaired by Nick Timothy. You'll note I am not Nick Timothy, who was meant to be chairing this evening. My facial hair couldn't even scratch the kind of Rasputin-esque Nick Timothy Chief of Staff era look. Nick's been chairing that work, leading it very ably with Gavin, who you'll hear from in a moment as director. And we've assembled a fantastic steering group for that, from kind of all wings of the party, people that bring different experiences and perspectives to the work, and two of whom are also joining me on the panel, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So how this evening is going to work, hear from our panel, I'll introduce them in a second. Want to come to them with a couple of questions and queries, but then leave plenty of time for you in the audience to jump in. I'm conscious that what's the big idea is quite a broad title, and therefore there might be different things that people who are here want to jump into, so we'll take plenty of time to do that. Who do we have here? At the front, Gavin Rice, Director of the Future of Conservatism project, advisor to government, think tanker, and at the moment working on the second paper in our Future of Conservatism project on economics and how we should think about the Conservative approach to economics. On my left, Juliet Samuel, a columnist at The Times, has been writing a wide number of very well-read, and I know because my WhatsApp always lights up with your column being shared around different groups, on industrial policy, on immigration, and on how the Conservative Party should be thinking about kind of economics and social issues in the next few years. So we're delighted that Juliet is joining us. And then to my right, Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, who's been thinking and curating a set of ideas via Conservative Home, most recently their series on reducing the demand for the state, thinking about how we invest in things like early intervention and prevention. So really delighted that Paul is also with us and that he's taken his time out to be on that steering group. Gavin, I'm going to start with you. You wrote a paper for us a couple of months ago, The Case for Conservatism, in which you tried to set out a kind of intellectual case, an intellectual framework for how the Conservative Party should reorient itself, what are the animating ideas, the animating principles that it should focus on. Give us a bit of a précis of that paper. What do you think the ideas are that are really going to matter in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Sure, thanks very much, Adam. I would stress that I co-wrote this paper with our chair, Nick Timothy, and that allows me to say that all of the elements of that paper, which were glowing with insight, expertise, accuracy, analysis, and powerful recommendations, were written by me, and all of the glaring factual errors we're going to attribute to him. But it was very much something which we worked on together in tandem, guided ably by our steering group, which, as some of you may know, is chaired by Michael Gove, and which has a wide range of politicians, journalists, thinkers, actors, movers, shakers, two of which you have in the room here today with you. The project, the paper as published is ours, and so therefore when I speak to the project, I'm talking about the ideas, the proposals, the arguments that Nick and I are making, guided by that steering group. So what's the purpose of the project? The project is to look at how we feel the centre-right needs to change in this country in the medium to long term, regardless of what happens as a result of the next election, whether it's government, whether it's opposition. Times change, and that means that parties need to change with them. Modernisation, change, development, renewal. This is something which happens all the time. Labour did it famously with the New Labour Revolution. The Conservatives did it with David Cameron. And we're seeking to address the longer-term economic and social problems which we believe have arisen within our country. Many of these predate the present period of Conservative government in their origins, but have continued during it. Many of these are of global or external cause. though we also suggest that perhaps they've been intensified in some ways or not dealt with by a policy consensus across the aisle, which we suggest has run out of road. So what is this policy consensus? Well, in very high-level terms, I would suggest that it's a sort of a laissez-faire liberalism in economics, which has prioritised global efficiency over the national interest, the needs of UK workers and communities. It has seen inequality, both of income and wealth, rise, and it has seen growth stall, so that the kinds of growth rates which might justify the sorts of inequality levels which we have seen in this country have simply not been there. You know, the rising tide classically is meant to raise all boats. Unfortunately, that rising tide has not been particularly evident over the course of the last 10 years or so. We also suggest that it's been characterized by a kind of cultural and social liberalism that's elevated the individual over the interests of the nation, community, families, and a sense of kind of shared identity as what we call the national community. And also an agnosticism, until very recently, we would suggest about place and the importance of geography, of locality, and where growth happens. That's something that we believe government needs to pay much more attention to. We've seen a renewed focus on that in recent Conservative governments, but we think that the scale and pace of that change needs to be far higher. We believe that we are centrists. Now, the term centre ground often gets bandied about in our popular political discourse, in the media, dare I say even in parliaments amongst our elected political representatives. Onward has done fantastic work historically on demonstrating where the actual real centre ground of voters lies, in papers including The Politics of Belonging, famously, No Turning Back, and other papers as well. And what it shows is that the average voter is supportive of capitalism, does believe in markets, but they do want and value more economic security than they've enjoyed in recent years. They value community, they value place and belonging. They want the ability to go far but to stay local. They don't necessarily want an economic model which presumes for success the necessity of geographical mobility, whether that's internationally or down towards the southeast. And they also believe in the importance of greater economic fairness, whether that's between social classes or between regions. They do value the importance of family. They value the importance of locality. They do believe in control of things like migration. They believe in strong borders and a strong nation state. Now, the popular understanding of the centre ground is almost precisely the opposite, which is a sort of social liberalism combined with a kind of a very laissez-faire, hands-off economic approach, as just described. So we think it's really important to assert where the true centre ground is, where the voting coalition of the future is going to lie. We believe that that coalition is out there for Conservatives if they want to take it, but it does mean that they perhaps need to think about certain questions in new ways. Final thing I would say is that we believe that markets in general work. Markets are the best way of delivering prosperity, innovation, growth, rising living standards. But the truth is markets always operate within certain constraints, most obviously and importantly within the constraint of the nation state, but also within regulatory frameworks which are there to actually improve the functioning of those markets and to serve the common good. We feel that the purpose of the economy should not be simply the maximization of efficiency in a global sense, but actually creating the kind of society which we and voters want to live in. And that's a society in which there is widespread, stable employment that is well paid, distributed across the country in a majority of areas, upon which individuals can rely, and importantly, upon which they can raise families. And everything plays into this, whether it's to do with industries that have declined or been offshored or are yet to be born and yet to grow, whether it's to do with the impact of the globalization of labor markets through mass migration. All of these questions, we believe, need to be looked at through that lens of creating the kind of economy that serves the sort of society we want to live in. And we believe that, in fact, that is conservatism.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gavin. Julia, let's come to you. So you've written in some detail about the symptoms of the decay of the current system. and also fleshed out some of the ideas that might animate what comes next. So give us a sense of those ideas. How should we be thinking about the renewal that Gavin talked about?
So I'll just cover a few areas, although the paper Gavin and Nick did is much more comprehensive. But I guess I'm going to cover economic policy. I think it's the most important part. Migration, and then just sort of institutional reform, essentially how to wield power. So on economic policy, I mean, you basically don't have a renewal or a new political idea unless you have an economic policy. And I think there are lots of different sort of outgrowths of ideas on the right at the moment, but there isn't really a coherent idea of what the new economic model should be. And there's a lot of work to do to hash out the details of the different approach that we should take. But essentially the problem is where conservatism needs to go is that it needs to conclusively move on from the shibboleths of the 1980s. Thatcher had a whole different set of economic problems to deal with than the ones we do today. Her main problem was that we had a whole stock of assets that were no longer useful, whose value hadn't been written down. We were poorer than we wanted to admit, and we were therefore spending beyond our means. Our problem now is that we're underinvesting. We're not actually creating new useful assets. And the question is why that is and how we can fix it. And I think to fix it, we essentially need to embrace the idea of a new industrial strategy or industrial policy, whatever you want to call it. One that looks very different from, you know, a 70s union rule policy of simply keeping assets going for the sake of it, and that learns more from successful examples, mostly in Asia, where governments have massively increased prosperity and productivity by involving themselves in key decisions about the economy and then unleashing the power of markets and innovation to do their job. So just to outline a few areas where that could be applied. I think essentially the government has to admit that it has a role in shaping how the economy looks. And I mean, the most obvious reason is for economic security and national security reasons. We can no longer have fragile supply chains strung out around the world in which we're blind to who is making what and why and for what and with what. And we have to take a view on that. The government has to take a view. That doesn't mean we have to start making everything here, but it does mean that we have to make sure critical things that we rely on are not made in places that are essentially untrustworthy or potentially hostile to us. So how are we going to do that? Well, there are all sorts of different methods that have been used in different economies, and I think where the future of conservatism needs to go is to work out which ones would suit us, in what sectors they would suit us, and how to implement them in a way that makes use of our strengths. And one example of how we could do that is we actually have a few institutions that already do some of these things. We just don't do them on a scale that actually makes a difference to our economy. So for example, the British Business Bank, which is a government-run bank, but which is run by commercial people who've worked in the private sector, it has to make a return. And it essentially subsidizes projects that are in key areas the government has identified. The problem with it is it's just too small. So that needs to be scaled up. Then we have other areas which are kind of big industrial projects where essentially the UK can't afford to let parts of our supply chain wither, where we have some assets or we could have more, and we're simply, we have to protect them. And that, we've seen the government already acting to some degree in that area by giving grants out to electric vehicle factories, for example, or for reducing the carbon intensity of steel production. And I think that approach needs to be expanded to other areas, you know, energy more broadly, and defence, where we're drastically behind the times in terms of what's needed, both us and our allies in Europe. And we have a completely incoherent approach right now because the government is prepared to underwrite certain projects like the Thames super sewer, but it doesn't apply the same approach to nuclear power. And there isn't a coherent reason why that is, or why the government shouldn't do that. And then you can have, you get into other areas, which is, for example, university degrees or the use of our universities, and this question of why exactly it is we should be subsidizing all sorts of arts degrees that essentially result in people who are less employable and not producing the skills that all of our industries tell us they need. And why, on what principle the government should be neutral on that based on the fact that it's funding at least 40% of these degrees, which are then written off, the loans are written off. And then there are other areas, specialisms where the UK already has strength, where the government is prepared to go forward and to support industry, for example, in artificial intelligence, but it's not seemingly prepared to do that in other areas like vaccine manufacturing. A lot of the opportunities created by the pandemic in that area simply were allowed to wither because we went straight back into the autopilot of, well, we don't subsidize those sorts of things, so you can go to Ireland and make your vaccines. And then the last obvious area is the use of procurement, again, which we saw during the pandemic can be unbelievably powerful in accelerating innovation and also in getting around all of the roadblocks we ourselves have built up in our dysfunctional state. So the vaccine task force over here and the Operation Warp Speed over in America were essentially, units that went outside the normal procurement process and were therefore more efficient when we were allowed to take much more risk because everyone agreed the situation called for it. There's no reason why that approach couldn't be applied more broadly to other areas. So the second area that I talk about is migration, the approach to migration. So it seems very clear that the approach that we have at the moment, the model, is not working. GDP may be going up, but GDP per capita has been stagnant for about a decade. And you have to ask what exactly is the point of a migration policy that simply increases the number of people without actually increasing the prosperity level of those people. But you need to, in order to reduce migration, you actually need to put some money and some thought into how you're going to do that. For example, if you were to pay care workers more, which the Migration Advisory Committee has been advising the government to do for years, or the government to put the funding so that the sector can do that, then you wouldn't have to increase migration up to 1 million gross or 700,000 net in order to avoid a crisis in your care sector. And you would probably actually save money in the long run because in fact the mix of immigration that we're getting is when you look into it at this point is going to cost us money, not going to save us money. So I think you need a model that includes the full costs of the policy, both to our economy and incentives to invest, and also to our standard of living, whether that's infrastructure becoming overcrowded and not being built to expand capacity, or whether that's the support that we need to offer to the people who are coming here. And then the last area that I want to talk about is that conservatives have traditionally been a group of people who understand institutions and the importance of institutions, but that seems to be something that we've completely forgotten now. We no longer know how to wield power, how to nourish institutions. We no longer know how to appoint people who have values like institutional neutrality, for example, or to even where we know legislation is causing problems. For example, the Equality Act, which on its own, when it was passed, had pretty uncontroversial principles in it, but is now morphed into a huge sort of administrative morass of norms and practices, which most on the right and most in the country don't actually agree with. And I think we need a mix of courage, of tactics and foresight, and then the ability to communicate and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that we don't simply get accused of entering into culture wars, but actually are able to explain in a reasonable tone why action is necessary and why things need to change. So I think, well, as I said, Gavin's covered a lot more in his paper, but I think if we were to look at those three areas, that would make a pretty good start in working out where conservatism needs to go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. There's a lot I want to dive into in questions in just a moment. But first, Paul, so you've been running these series on Conservative Home, curating a whole series of voices, but you yourself have written about some of the ideas that need to inform what comes next and have bore witness to previous phases of renewal. How do you think about this question of the ideas that need to animate the party, the movement, the Conservative family in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Well, starting at the beginning, the future of conservatism is a challenging subject, but it's not half as challenging as the present of conservatism as we wait for the vote at 7 o'clock. And I do tend to come at this as someone who was a member of parliament, albeit in opposition for 10 years, and then returned to journalism. So I can't take myself away from that way of looking at things. And I want to do something in this conversation that we're expressly not allowed to do, Adam, in these steering group meetings you've asked me to, which is I want to assume, for the purposes of this discussion, the Conservatives don't win the next election. Now, that's something that we're not allowed to discuss in front of the politicians when they're on this committee, but since they're not here tonight, I think I can venture the thought that as we sit here now, the Conservatives are more likely to lose than win, so let's have a conversation on that basis. I think, picking up a word you used, Gavin, at the start, that they will need to undertake the fourth big modernisation since the Second World War. So you're the 45 to 51 modernisation, led by Rab Butler and a younger generation of Conservatives, including Maudling and MacLeod and Enoch Powell. Then the Thatcher modernisation of the late 70s, and then the one in which I was involved at the margins, the Cameron modernisation of 05 to 2010. Of those, pretty clearly the Thatcher one was the most successful, simply in electoral terms, and in delivering long periods of Conservative government. I think there are really two aspects to modernisation, and let me just describe what they are before diving into some of the issues that others have raised. The first is modernisation tries to get, as Gavin and Nick's paper does, to the root of a problem. I don't think the Thatcher government was particularly good at doing this. The Cameron opposition wasn't bad, but very laboriously and through immense difficulty, the Thatcher government was trying to find its way to what the heart of the problem was that it was trying to solve. The next thing that modernisation consists of, which exists in tension with this first aim, is that it's got to, as the Cameron people used to say in the 2000s, meet people where they are. And actually, it's a lot more difficult to meet people where they are now than it was even 15 years ago, because they're all over the place. They're in different bits of social media, they're consuming their own stuff, they don't necessarily read the thing their neighbour reads. And there is a particular difficulty, therefore, with this next coming aspect of modernisation, which is there is a tendency on bits of the right, and I say this in some embarrassment as the editor of a Conservative Home, there's a tendency to talk to ourselves a bit and to become preoccupied with issues that are not necessarily of first importance to the voters. To give you an example, we spend a lot of time debating the merits or otherwise of the BBC. Lots of older people are familiar with the BBC. Lots of younger people are not looking at the BBC at all. And if we put an nth of our energy into, I don't know, childcare policy, rather than whatever Gary Lineker's up to today, we might get a more productive result. Anyway, be that as it may, so what is the problem? For me, it all hinges around a very uncomfortable word, one that's very difficult to discuss with the wider electorate, but is very much in Gavin's paper, which is demographics. Juliet referred to some of the aspects of this. If you're in demographic decline, even though our situation's a lot better than some of our neighbours, what are your options? You can work longer, great, but sooner or later you will run into voter resistance. You can take more migration, but I think we all know from recent experience that's not necessarily easy. You can cut your public services, no one wants to do that, or you can wait for AI to deliver you a miracle rescue. And some of us are a bit skeptical about whether everything about AI will be upside. So you have that sort of problem to deal with, exacerbated, and this is a very strong aspect of the Gavin-Nick paper, by the fact that wealth and opportunity are highly concentrated in what I call the Greater Southeast, which is anything that feels London's gravitational pull. It's a really big slice of England. So what do you do about this? Well, I suspect the Conservatives in opposition will be thinking about two different things in relation to these two different parts of England, leaving aside the rest of the UK for a moment. In the south, there's this huge problem of housing, which I really don't need to stress to the audience of this age. Just leave it to pass that there's this enormous housing problem that no one seems to know how to solve. The Conservative Party is increasingly being driven back on older voters. So there's going to be a heck of a debate about this in opposition. How do we build the houses we need, where we need to build them? Since some of the, or a lot of the demand for them is in the south, building more would tend to exacerbate the economic advantage of the south. And this, I think, is where you get into some of Juliet's stuff about industrial strategy. And if I said the problems of the south were about housing, those of the rest of the country with which I'm less familiar seem to me to be a kind of mix of transport and devolution and skills. It's all that. It's kind of building up centres of prosperity to balance the wealth and prosperity of the southeast. I won't linger on the childcare issue, which is a very important aspect of Gavin and Nick's paper. I won't address the wider constitutional and integration challenges, which are a huge part of the present conversation. But I would close by just asking a few questions, really, about this quite nationalistic, quite interventionist, not quite protectionist kind of Gavin thesis. My question really about it in the steering group was, our levels of debt are very high. Our tax burden is very high, and Gavin would say quite truthfully that compared to our international competitors, it's not necessarily that high. Growth is anemic. The kind of industrial strategy that Juliet was describing, for example, spending more on defence, this is going to take place in very straitened financial circumstances. And if you're going to spend more on X, you're very soon going to find that you have to spend less on Y. And very substantial areas of public spending, like the courts and the justice system, have got really squeezed over the last 13 years. So my question would be sort of what happens to all that? So how do you form a framework for all this? My framework is kind of a bit more inclined to say the three modernisations of the past all stressed smaller state, stronger society in one way or the other. I'm pretty reluctant to think the Conservatives can move off that ground. I think in 2017, we fought an election which we really didn't have a countervailing economic message to Jeremy Corbyn, and that's one of the reasons we ran into so much trouble. Like, you do have to have a different economic message. But a lesson of the Truss experience is you can't just cut tax without cutting your spending. And you can't cut your supply of government without first reducing the demand. I think it's very difficult to do, and it's something that's as much cultural as political. But if you can cut the demand, if you can get stronger families, better schools, good jobs, this sort of self-reinforcing triangle, your bills for prison, probation, mental health, debt counselling, all that does make an impact on that. So reducing demand for government ought to be an important part of what opposition does. Finally, the one element that's not really in Gavin and Nick's paper, because it's a bit, it's one of the few things they decided was outside their reach, was something the Conservatives have not really done since the coalition, which was public service reform. The Cameron government did a lot of public service reform. of the welfare system with universal credit. There was the health reform, which is actually not a particularly good example of one that worked, and the education reforms, which are a much better one of those that did. I think the Conservatives need to start getting their minds around public service reform again, because at the last election, the basic offer was we'll do Brexit and we'll spend masses of Boris Johnsonian money on lots of nice things. I think the time you can just say that has come to an end. And just last, postscript. I've been very gloomy, but the one bit of good news, I think, is that if I think back to 1996, there was no centre-right ecosystem. There was a very enfeebled Centre for Policy Studies, the ASI and the IEA, and that's about it. And you've now gone onward. You have Policy Exchange, you have the Centre for Social Justice. You've got all sorts of organisations knocking around the idea space that weren't there then. So from that point of view, unusually, I'm optimistic.
There we go, no pressure. Reason to be optimism, onward, brilliant. Let's come to some questions. Juliet, can I come to you first? So some of the things you listed in that section around economics, almost all of which I agree with, the need to focus on the kind of resilience of our supply chains, remove the taboo about subsidy that you've written about before, having a serious industrial strategy. They could be described or bundled together as the really ugly term Securenomics. Rachel Reeves has been talking about a lot of these things. She's sort of laid claim to the modern supply side progressivism that Janet Yellen has been talking about in the US. And at the moment, it seems like that bundle of ideas has found more of a home at the moment on the centre left than on the centre right. So I guess my question is, should the centre right be grabbing that set of ideas, not calling it Securenomics, but saying we have ownership? Or actually, is there an important difference that I'm missing between what you're describing and what Rachel Reeves is putting forward?
I think the right should be grabbing it. I think the fact, if both, wings of our politics coalesce or move in a certain direction, that's probably a sign that it's what circumstances require. Mm-hmm. And often policy in countries changes, because the world changes, not necessarily because particular people or elections, determining which parties in power change. For example, if a war is coming, doesn't matter which party is in charge, you rearm, mm-hmm. Or hopefully you rearm. But I think there is an important difference in that. I think the right could do it better, and I think that the left's version of an industrial strategy. Parts of it may work, and it's better than nothing. But there's also a strong likelihood that large chunks of it are going to get captured by interests, like whether it's unions, whether it's green activism, whether it's so-called social justice initiatives. And we really, as Paul mentioned, we cannot afford to waste money and time. Mm-hmm. We have to do this efficiently. We have to do it better than the US is doing it. We have to do it better than China is doing it, because they can spray money all around and we can't. We have to focus it completely on productivity and growth. I don't actually even think, Keir Starmer, for example, in his speech last week mentioned that Securenomics involves restricting the labour market more, for example. Mm-hmm. I don't think that is a good approach to improving our competitiveness, which essentially is what this is about. I think you provide people with more secure jobs by having a more vibrant economy with a wider range of sectors that are thriving up and down the country. So I think that the right should and could grab this and could do it better. And I don't think it's a weakness that Labour's also moving in that direction.
Yeah. Paul, let me ask you, an MP was reported in this morning's breakfast meeting with the Prime Minister to have said, the problem is that we just keep doing socialist things. We're just socialists at the moment, the Conservative Party, which is quite an amusing observation. But actually, when we've done polling, so we did a piece of work a little while ago on net zero, ended up coming out as Hotting Up, was basically some polling that looked at public preferences. And when you ask people who should bear the burden of the transition, particularly around things like retrofit and the installation of heat pumps, the public basically believe the state should do it. The kind of majority view is that the state should be investing a significant amount of money, taxpayer money, in doing some of these things. If you look at that by voter segment, it's actually Conservative 2019 voters that are most enthusiastic about the state playing that role. And I wonder if there is something about the pandemic, about the rise in energy prices and what the response has been, that has shifted permanently, an expectation of what the state does. Now, you've talked a lot about how we can shift the demand for it, et cetera, But has something changed about what people expect from the state? And should we push back against that as Conservatives or go with the grain?
I think it's right to say that these things come and go in waves. So, after the Second World War, there's great enthusiasm for planning. And this goes on through the 50s and the 60s until the system begins to get fragile. And along comes Thatcher and the monetarists and the tax cutters. Then you have a moderately interventionist period from Blair, although he accepts the Thatcher free market premise and the reshaped economy. And by 2010, I think this is right, the polls were suggesting that voters had run out of patience with all this spending. They just thought they were not getting good value from it. So we're now going through another swing in the cycle where after COVID and the war, when you go through a period where you have an economic heart attack, which is kind of like what COVID was, I can dig you out the columns by Alistair Heath and John Redwood saying that at that point there was no choice but to intervene because the economy is having a heart attack. So it takes a long time to wean yourself off it, and you probably have to wait first for the signs that it's really not working to become more apparent. Now, I wasn't at this breakfast meeting, so I don't know what this MP meant, but he probably meant we're not cutting taxes enough. But I go back to where I was. To cut taxes, you've got to cut the supply of government. And cutting the supply of government is fiendishly hard. And although cutting the demand for it isn't a sort of panacea, you've really got to go there. So I would hope the MP concerned might have thought a bit about that.
Well, it was reported that the response to the MP from the Prime Minister was, we are Conservatives, look at the tax cuts we just introduced, right? That was the reassuring comment. And Gavin, that's what I want to ask you about. You in your paper, you didn't emphasise tax cuts as being a priority, right? As the first thing that should be animating a kind of next wave of Conservative renewal. But how big a shift is that? People would sometimes, as a shorthand, describe the Conservatives as a party of small state, low tax. That might be the offer on the doorsteps. It might not be to the degree that it was in the Liz Truss mini-budget, but surely reducing taxes, cutting taxes is one of the ideas that should inform the next phase of renewal, or should we be thinking about it differently?
Well, I'd say a couple of things there. We've talked about Thatcher a little bit this evening, and one of the arguments that we make is that we need to have the sort of the spirit and the boldness of Thatcher, but not necessarily the same policies, not because those policies were wrong at the time, they were right at the time, but we have a completely different set of challenges right now. We don't have a top rate of income tax of 83%. We don't have incredibly high taxes on unearned income. We don't have a vast social housing stock and loads of unproductive nationalised industries. Our challenges are quite different. I would actually like to see a smaller tax burden. Paul might be surprised to hear, but I think one of the things that we say in the paper is that the rising tax burden almost exactly tracks the rise in the old age dependency ratio. So the rising tax burden in the UK is chiefly characterised by our demographic realities, and any sensible conservative economic approach to dealing with that tax burden must take that seriously and deal within that reality. We can't do unfunded tax cuts. The debacle of the Liz Truss quasi-quartering mini-budget showed us that, if we didn't already know it in advance. So the problem the solution has to lie elsewhere. I think Paul's right that we do need to find sophisticated ways of reducing the overall demand for government. We also need to try and grow our way out of it. If you grow your economy, then hopefully over time you can decelerate that rising tax burden or even put it into reverse. Just final point I'll make on that. you know, when you start talking about doing things differently economically as a conservative, of course people say, oh, you're just a statist or you're just a socialist or whatever it may be. I think the interesting thing about our current state is that it does both too much and too little. So it regulates inefficiently where it shouldn't, especially in the domain of commercial and residential planning, and that holds back planning approvals for industry. It holds back house building, but also other areas of our economy as well. It does too much in what I might call therapeutic spending. We spend a lot of money compensating for failure, whether that's through in-work benefits, topping up people's wages, whether it's paying for the costs of social breakdown, whether that's through family fragility, whether it's the cost of fixing poor health or addiction problems or whatever it is. So we do an awful lot, but it's all operational expenditure. It's not capital expenditure. And we don't do enough, I would suggest, in areas where there might be a return on investment. So we don't want to nationalise industries. We don't want to subsidise inefficiency. But there are areas where the state could play a more active role, but in ways which actually generate a return on investment and then create the conditions for market-driven growth, as we've seen in other parts of the world, especially the Asian tiger economies. So I think there are ways in which we could reduce the tax burden or at least mitigate its rise, but it's not a straightforward case of cutting the top headline rate of income tax.
Very good. On the top rate of income, not top rate of income tax necessarily, but on young people specifically, right? So if you are a parent of 3 children earning £50,000 and a graduate, your marginal tax rate is 77%.
That's right.
So like there are some margins, some groups where I think we both agree huge amount of focus needs to be.
That's right. And I think the question of how much we tax is a separate question from are we taxing in the right way? And I would suggest we need to be taxing in order to promote investment and in order to support families, rather than trying to simply cut in a blunt instrument, unsophisticated way.
Very good. Okay, we're going to open up to questions. We have plenty of time for a few, so let's take a cluster of 3. There were 3 hands that shot up here, so one at the front there, one in the second row there, and one right behind you there. But we'll have time for another group, I promise. So let's go up there. If you could just say kind of name and affiliation and then question, that'd be great.
Sure. Joseph Roberts from the Epoch Times. So just a question really to this kind of overarching red wall term that we've seen crop up since 2019. And I think a lot of those voters, it was fair to say, were voting for something that was authentically conservative. And one of the problems has been that most have claimed that this government and previous governments have operated almost to the left of Blair on a lot of policy issues. So for those voters, I'm just asking the panel, as a wide point, what can be shown, what can be done by the Tory party to really reclaim hearts and minds in that sense and show that there's been a shift back towards the centre?
Okay, excellent. So how do we retain the rebel, make sure that we keep some of those voters on side? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Andrew Hawkins from Whitestone Insight. I ran Comrades for about 20 years, 20 years ago. And some of those changes that Paul talks about, in particular for over the Cameron years, I think a lot of people will look back on and wonder what the big idea was. What are the Conservatives standing for? And it goes all the way back to when David Cameron stood for the Tory leadership. And the problem with the answers that have come since then is that the Conservative government, successive Conservative government's actions haven't matched what they said that they stood for. We've wasted the crises of Brexit and the pandemic, and I just hope and pray that we won't waste the crisis of what could be a heavy defeat next year. So I guess I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think the Conservatives stand for anymore? Large state, small state? We just don't know, because the performance hasn't reflected that. And one very minor, just the point, not so minor, point of the demographic issues that Paul rightly touched on. And one you missed out on, which also goes back to the tax burden, is one which may be ridiculed in some quarters, but is actually looking at our own birth rates, and along with other developed and not so developed economies, and what we might do about that, and whether part of being a conservative is actually to promote the family and family formation, and to encourage a replacement, us actually maintaining a replacement birth rate, which is something that we're not doing at the moment.
Great. Thank you very much. Then questions just back there.
Thank you. Will Prescott, Will Prescott, Bright Blue. I totally agree with your thesis that the Tories generally are the most successful. The Thatcher period is a bit of an exception when they take a pragmatic attitude to the state. Sceptical, but also quite willing to use it as and when necessary. question is, how do you get the party to accept that when there is a very large chunk of the party, particularly membership, which, for better or worse, has a real say in choosing the leader? Backs Liz Truss, backs the idea of tax cuts for the sake of tax cuts, and in some levels even genuinely believes that Rishi Sunak is a socialist because he does not cut taxes. How do you do this? Is it going to take a second catastrophic defeat on a sort of really tax-cutting platform to do that? I'd just like to know how to do it.
Very good. I'm feeling the optimism in the room. This is great. So we've got 3 questions I'm just repeating for the stream so we can hear it. One on the kind of red wall, those voters, how we might retain them. Another on the kind of rhetoric reality gap, like how do we know what the Conservatives stand for? And then a third there on how we might, are there small state ideologues in the Conservative Party? And if so, how might we negotiate with them? Juliet, can I come to you first on this second question? That maybe the problem is not what the Conservative Party has been saying, but it's been the revealed preference, that actually there's been a gap between those intentions and that reality. Is that true in your observation? And if so, how do we deal with that?
It's partly true. And I think that's partly to do with the point I made about being unable to wield power and not understanding the levers of power anymore. I mean, you've had lots of big ideas from the Tories, net zero, Brexit, reducing migration. They just haven't actually managed to enact any of them effectively. So that's a complete failure of just sort of competent statecraft. And I mean, when you can have a great critique of the state, which Dominic Cummings does, but then if you go into power and you can't actually enact any of your ideas, then it's not much good. As for what the Tories stand for, or what they should stand for, I suppose, is national cohesion and national strength, and belief in the nation and its future. I mean, I think, I'm not sure that all of the Conservatives do believe in that. I think that the purge that Boris Johnson was forced to carry out to get Brexit done maybe revealed that a lot of people didn't believe in that. It helped to clarify that issue, but I think you still have a lot of confusion about what the party is for. On the question of red wall voters, I don't think the party can do much before the next election to persuade them. I mean, they're desperate to get some flights to Rwanda off the ground. I don't think they're going to be able to do that, but I guess that would be a symbol of something.
We'll know more in about 15 minutes on that, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if this bill passes, frankly, I don't think it's going to work in whatever version, the Rebels want or the version the government wants. But I do think the policies I was outlining on industrial strategy and an actual plan to reduce migration and some leaders who appear to actually believe in doing that would be a start. And then on the question of how you persuade the party, you have to persuade them that that's what will allow you to win. And if, I mean, Boris Johnson was not a Thatcherite, but the party loved him because he won. So you need the right leadership and the right strategy to win an election, and I think the party would follow.
For what it's worth on that point about what the Conservatives stand for, in our report after the fall, in fact, there may be missing millennials as well, when you ask people, the Conservative Party is at its best when, you do get a range of answers that are around its best when it cuts taxes or cuts down on crime, whatever else. Number one is almost always stands up for Britain or some version of that. There's a form of patriotism which both speaks to the kind of non-ideological version of the Conservative Party, but also the values that it thinks it promotes when it wins. Paul, can I come to you on this question about the red wall, the kind of first question, and actually kind of more broadly, Onward argued quite kind of forcefully, quite clearly, that the election result in 2019 meant a change in how the Conservative Party governed, a change in the sorts of policies that it put forward. No turning back was the name of the paper that we did trying to analyse that voting coalition. Was that the right thing to do? Was the kind of the fall of the red wall, quote unquote, a really significant seismic shift? Because it wasn't one that you noted in your kind of modernisations or transformations. Or did we overinterpret that result and now we should be thinking about a previous coalition or a different coalition of voters?
Well, technically, red wool is a term invented by James Kanagasorian, the pollster, meant, I think it's a seat the Conservatives had not held before. So a classic example would be Bishop Auckland. Let's just consider Bishop Auckland for a moment. If you look at Bishop Auckland, the Labour majority in Bishop Auckland have been coming down year on year. It's bigger in 01 than 05. It's bigger in 05 than 2010. Helen Goodman, no relation, you can see the Labour vote going. I think the reason for this is that the kind of class element in voting patterns has got weaker. The age element has got stronger. So I don't think lots of red wool voters are going to rush back to the Tories anytime soon, but their historical link with Labour has been broken. So it's possible to make an appeal there over time. I'm just a bit cautious about the idea that they want some sort of simplified form of right-wing conservatism, because once you get out of the Greater Southeast, I think you're a bit more public services dependent. So these sort of voters, I think they're far more likely to be your classic Nick Timothy, Gavin Rice sort of voters, that they're a bit on the right on culture and a bit to the left on economics. So any Tory appeal is going to have that group of people into account. Just on Andrew's point about families, sure, but it's very difficult to pitch this electorally. The National Conservative, was anyone here at the National Conservative Conference? Anyone? And William was.
I really thought we'd have more of a Venn diagram there. Okay.
Yeah, just curious, because the demographic thing came up, and the family thing came up, and my fellow commentators were busy writing that these people are all urging you to have more children. So pitching this to voters, in particular, I suspect women voters, is really quite tricky.
But that was young. The National Conservative Conference was full of young people. That was what was striking about it.
Yeah, but how many out of the whole?
30% were under.
No, but I mean as the proportion of young people as a whole.
Oh no, yeah,
Right.
not huge, but
Right.
as compared to the Conservative movement as a whole, possibly
Yeah,
larger.
but
Let's come to you, Gavin, on this third question about kind of small staters. So are there, in your view, the kind of group of people in the Conservative Party that will always be fundamentally small state? And if so, how do we persuade them? How do we find common cause? Or actually, is that not the right diagnosis of the Conservative Party today?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the Conservative Party's got a demographic challenge of its own, and people tend to solidify their political views sometime between the ages of 20 and 30, and they're very shaped by the sort of the era that they have lived through. And for some that was the Thatcher era, for some it was Blair, the boom years. I suspect maybe for you and I, Adam, and maybe some others in the room, it was probably the financial crisis and the kind of the aftermath of that. I mean, my instinct is that viewing the entirety of politics and policy through the question of is it big state or is it small state has had its day. And I think inevitably kind of Western developed democracies will just end up moving away from that. I think there'll be some wiggle room, some will be more interventionist and some will be less interventionist. I don't think that's going to be the main political divide going forward. I think the sort of the political cultural, if that's the term, divide revealed by the Brexit referendum, which cut across the traditional party divide, was a different one from left-right, economically, big state, small state. I suspect it was probably a better, more realistic reflection of the real kind of cultural, tribal differences within the country. And I suspect what we're going to move towards is a West in which the divide is much more between a kind of a national localism that emphasises the nation-state, borders, the national interest, combined with a greater degree of social solidarity on the one hand, and then a kind of a borderless global internationalism which is less concerned about roots and is perhaps less redistributive as well on the other. So my own view, for what it's worth, is just that a different dichotomy is going to emerge, and perhaps it's just a bit of a waiting game.
Somewheres and nowheres. David Goodhart is back. I don't get that. Okay. Let's come to. There we go. Love that book. Let's go through more questions. You wanted to jump in here at the front. I'll take one just back there, and I should definitely. I'm going to go halfway up there to you, William. So let's take those three, and then I think we might have time for a couple more. So yeah.
First of all, how can I feel the issue about taxes has become really divisive in the party. It led to this trust. Pardon me.
No, you're okay.
A leader who was psychologically unfit to lead. Just because everybody believes that, we have low taxes, go back to Margaret Thatcher. The reality is this, that I think we need to move beyond low taxes into holistically developing growth. We also have a culture war in this country. We also try to foment a culture war in this country. In America, you can have a culture war for reasons which are unique to America. This country, the culture war just makes the party more and more inward-looking. And it means that, although I think some people who engage with the culture war, like Miriam Case, do actually have social justice points, it's actually just used as a way for the party to be nasty. And to appeal to a certain bigoted vote base, what would be said to be viewed upon by many under 45 as a bigoted base. And we've got to, how can we end the fascination of culture wars, low taxes, and how can we actually engage in social justice issues? I know some of these issues can't be eye-catching.
Yeah.
Can't be eye-catching, they're probably unfashionable, and are probably actually quite difficult to work through.
Very good. Okay, so two parts of there, kind of one on tax and kind of low tax, similar to the one on the state previously, and then a broader question about the culture war, how we should think about it, engage in it, are we fomenting it, that sort of stuff. Let's take the question back there.
Yeah, I was wondering if the panel could comment on why they feel that the current economic dispensational paradigm has run out of road. Put a kind of just a sort of thought experiment. If we just focused on, I say this by the way as somebody who has a lot of sympathy for the idea that it's totally run out of road and was persuaded by how Ada works and that story. If we got the regulation right, dealt with the planning issues, etc., and did nothing else, right, so you could actually build things, wouldn't that deal with an awful lot of problems? And are we again, I have a lot of sympathy for this idea, but are we overcomplicating?
Okay, very good. And then a question there in the middle.
So it strikes me the panel has dealt with various different questions that conservative parties have been facing in recent years, whether that's the size of the state, or that it's the general inability of Conservative ministers since 2010 to pull the levers of government and actually get them to do anything. But one thing that strikes me, especially over the last 4 years since 2019, which what the 4th anniversary we're celebrating today, is that the entirety of Boris Johnson's government, for better or worse, and it's whether how quickly you thought he would have fallen out with Dominic Cummings, you can leave to the side, has been thrown off the course by the COVID pandemic and then the situation in Ukraine. And this is very much a sort of Parliament style, events before events kind of problem. And it's very nice for us to sort of sit here navel-gazing about whether we want to create some sort of Tory Denmark or if we want to sort of ape Singapore without all the stuff that actually makes Singapore a unique state. But it strikes me the thing we should really be thinking about is the fact the international situation is currently very grim and only going to get worse over the next 5 years. E.g., we're going to see a war with China that's going to cause a global meltdown. So one thing I'd like to just ask the panelists how withered they think Tory foreign policy thinking is, and whether necessarily outsourcing it to John Bew for the last 4 years was a mistake. And if Tory foreign policy thinking really is that withered, what can great illustrious organisations like Onward and Conhome do to try and reinvigorate it?
Very good. William thought we weren't quite depressed enough. So I was like, there are wars coming. Okay, so 3 questions there. Foreign policy, why is our economic model run out of road? And I want to take the second part of your question on the culture wars. It's okay, I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to direct these to each of the panelists. Paul, the culture wars question, how should we think about this? Because there are very passionate views from within the party that maybe aren't always expressed publicly. Some will say this is a complete waste of time, we should not be engaging in this, we should talk about other things. And others will say it is the animating issue that the centre-right, the Conservative Party should be focusing on. Where do you land on that? How should we think about the bundle of issues that are described sometimes as the culture wars?
Well, first of all, even if there was not a Conservative Party, there would be culture wars. The culture wars are happening. And they happen in all sorts of different ways. So to me, they're more like a sort of chaotic civil war than a kind of war where there's one side or another. You wake up one morning and the issue is free speech in universities. Next, it's where trans prisoners might go. Next, it's free speech. Next, it's gender. It's a basket of different things. And I think the Conservative Party, therefore, is caught up in this war, whether it likes it or not. It's a question of how you negotiate it. And I want to give you an example of where I think it negotiated it well and where it negotiated it not so well. Where it negotiated it really badly was from some of my friends, and I thought for a while they might be right, during Black Lives Matter and Take the Knee. Some people I know were convinced there'd be very strong resistance among football supporters to take a knee. No, actually, I go, every other Saturday for my sins, Wycombe Wanderers. They take the knee, no one really cares. The crowd sort of took it up as a kind of pinch of incense against racism, and people who thought the crowds would object en masse turned out to be wrong. However, just consider for a moment trans Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. I mean, trans effectively played a part in bringing Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP down. So there's an instance where culture war had tremendous force. So I think it's a kind of matter of picking your ground, getting the tone right. I think above all, if you're caught up in a war, it's a kind of bad thing to look as though you are, and indeed actually to enjoy it.
Julia, I feel this is a very easy pitch for you, but have the Conservative Party lost their way on foreign policy?
Yes. They're still stuck in a kind of the paradigm of, we don't need to think about the world in terms of hostile or allied. We just think about, numbers and efficiency and, and opportunism, and that's obviously no longer the case. On that score, there are worse people than John Buse. Just would be nice if there were a few senior politicians who actually were paying any attention to this stuff. Number 10, particularly on China, is just completely adrift, and issues like, should the monarchy of Abu Dhabi be allowed to buy a major newspaper in this country? Obviously, no, it shouldn't. And any sense of the world as it is would lead you to the obvious answer on that. And then the Foreign Office's job is not to say, well, you can't block that because it will cause a diplomatic awkwardness. Their job is to tell the government how they can block it in the least damaging way, in a way that preserves our interests the most. And they've completely lost the plot on what their job is and how to determine who is a friend and a foe and why it matters. And this goes to the heart of a lot of policy, trade policy, national security policy. We have the completely insane spectacle of we've passed this national security bill that's meant to make it easier for the government to crack down on foreign interference or at least make it visible. And now they're not even going to apply the regime it creates to China, even though the whole point of it was to make visible the problem of united front of Chinese interference in the UK. So there's just complete incoherence and denial, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. Gavin, I'm going to give you a condensed version of the second question on kind of why is it that our economic models run out of road. If someone said to you, I basically reject the premise of your paper, the economy might have some challenges at the moment, but record levels of employment, growth in key sectors, there are some things that are quite good about it. What's your response to them? What's the kind of key thing you point to that says, obviously our model is broken, have a look at X? What's your answer?
Well, real household incomes have not gone up since 2005, is basically it. Combined with rising income inequality, rising asset inequality, declining social mobility as well. It's not even as though we've got a very kind of unequal yet dynamic economy which people can rise up through rugged individualism. We have both low mobility and high inequality and low growth. So sort of all three are in the wrong place. I agree with you, sir, that I think planning and house building is a massive part of the jigsaw. I think the ability to get on the housing ladder and have a home is fundamental to growth and to having a better performing economy for families. I think it's a fundamental issue of social justice as well, actually, for what it's worth. So yes, we're very big on planning reform and housing, as all Conservatives and in fact all people should be. I don't think it only stops there. Something we argue for very strongly in our paper is that we need to, as Conservatives, represent the needs, views, values and interests of the average voter, both in cultural questions actually, but also in economic questions too. And I think for too long, the needs and interests of medium and lower income households have not been well serviced by the current, by the status quo. We've a lot of the industries in our economy which have high growth potential, particularly in manufacturing, have declined relative to our economy. We've got a lot of industries and sectors where there's not much capacity for productivity growth. Your hospitalities, your retails, etc. They've got their place, but I would argue that our sectoral mix is far too dependent upon those. Very hard to improve productivity in those. I think our trade deficit is far too high, leaving us exposed to the sort of hostile trading partners that Juliet talks about. And I also think that the economic status and the bargaining power of workers, especially working class voters, has been corroded through mass migration, through completely, I would suggest, unfair economic competition due to the globalization of labour markets. So I would say, yes, I agree with you, but it's a yes and, not a yes only that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gavin. We're going to have to wrap up there. A quick pitch to say that, as Paul kind of teed up, Onward are thinking about all of these topics and more. So we're working with a series of MPs to launch in the new year a new deal for parents, which will specifically look at some of the challenges that you described, housing, marginal tax rates, but also the fact that at the moment families aren't having as many children as they say they want to when you survey them, right? We're doing a lot of work on talent, skills and opportunity, looking at what worked and what didn't in schools and how we might replicate that in colleges, universities and in workplace training, carrying all of our work on science and technology and our program as well on net zero, particularly the pinch points that are facing consumers when it comes to electric vehicles and decarbonisation. I hope within that there is something that interests you. I'm not sure why you'd be here if it didn't. And please do engage with us on that. Come to our events, have a look at our research. But for now, thank you all for coming along. Please thank my panel for this evening's event.